Well, first off, I want to thank the D&AD for inviting us here. I'm always looking for a great excuse to go to my second favorite city in the world, only behind my home city of New York. So it's been really lovely being here. And thank you all for joining us here today. We want to begin the talk back in 1922. And I want to introduce you to this person. And I can't see anything, but does anyone know who this is by any chance? Raise your hand. So if you were thinking it's Brian Collins' grandfather, you're wrong. Similar hair, but not him. This is William Addison Dwiggins. So why am I bringing this guy up? Well, this guy was a little bit of a polymath of the visual arts. He was into typography, book design, this is clicking, illustration, printmaking, typography, emerging modernist graphics. He was a little bit of a renaissance of the visual arts. Now, at the time, what he did was called applied art. It was sort of a function of bringing art and applying it to industrial practices. Now, had you told that to him, he probably would have been, or I know for a fact, he would have been really pissed off because he didn't think that's what he did. His job wasn't to apply art to a piece of industrial manufacture. He said, I'm actually something different. When I can do all of this stuff, I'm actually a graphic designer. And so historically, he is the first person to use the phrase graphic designer. And it's a very simple phrase, it's sort of mundane to us, but really this was an important moment in the historical arc of design because it moved what we do today from a function of part of an industrial process to a profession. Something that was multidisciplinary, something that moved across a lot of different domains of work. And so this is a really interesting kind of paradigm that I kind of want to pull back and abstract away from, which is this idea of it was a movement from an old game to a new game. So I'm going to pause on this for a moment because this is a really important idea, and it's really central to the theme of this conversation today. And a game is something that we all choose to play by a certain set of agreed rules to achieve a level of success that we collectively define and understand with each other. So when we talk about the idea of moving from an old game to a new game, what we're really talking about is how the rules have changed in what we do, and we recognize that we have to evolve in order to be successful. And again, that definition of success can be a little different for different people, but it fundamentally means we need to change what we're doing to evolve into the future. And so this is what Addison did. Now let's jump forward into the 1970s, where graphic design was still practiced, but there was another shift from an old game to a new game. And I want to introduce you to a campaign. Now I can't say that this was the moment when everything changed, but what I can say is that this is one of the most interesting visual representations of a shift from graphic design to the new game, and I'll explain it in a moment.
7 up, 7 up, we see the light of 7 up.
We couldn't have made it through the day without something to show the way, without something to keep us going.
Make it through the night if you don't have some kind of light that's showing up. 7 up, 7 up, we've seen the light of 7 up, 7 up, 7 up, we've seen the light of 7 up.
So you know how sometimes you look at work and you're really jealous, wishing that it would be part of your portfolio? I would love to have had that be part of the Collins portfolio, even today. So why did I bring that up? So this was probably one of the best examples of this idea of graphic design not just being something where we apply graphics, but where we start thinking of a holistic system, a holistic program of activity. Because the aesthetic style, the graphic choices in that television commercial weren't just for that commercial. It started to be about the entire visual expression advertising campaign of 7 Up. And while they pulled in lots of different really interesting illustrators, one of my favorite being Max Power, who did the stuff on the far right. It all kind of came from the same ethos of almost this like hallucinogenic Art Nouveau kind of optimistic, expressive quality. And it wasn't just the ad campaign either. The packaging design was incredible. And so you saw the television commercial with those gestures of the bubble being brought into the campaign. And what we start to see here is a new paradigmatic shift in what we do from graphic design to communication design. And if you were practicing in that era, that would have been a term that you would have described your profession as. I'm not a graphic designer, I'm a communication designer. I'm responsible for the broader expression across different media. And that was really driven by the explosion of broadcast and national media, advertising being the predominant creative profession and business model driving everything. And so that lasted for a while until we get to about the 1990s. And another shift started to happen. And it really came from a book, and really, actually, it was a big part of the London scene and the London dialogue around design, that it wasn't just about communication design of how we manage advertising campaigns. It was about how we manage the voice, both visually, verbally, and personality-wise, of a brand. And so Wally Olins wrote this book. It was actually 1978, but it took a little while for this actually to take shape as a new idea of an identity for a profession. But this is really the time when the idea of brand design started emerging. And if any of you began practicing in the 90s or in the even early 2000s like I did, that was a moment when you were constantly told it's not about the corporate mark, it's not about the logo, it's about the system around it. That's how you really differentiated yourself as a designer. And so what you see again is this new shift from an old game to new game. It's not just about designing stuff to make all the advertising look good, it's about designing the whole brand. Let's jump forward to 2024 to today. This post, I don't know if anyone saw this, but this post appeared about 2-ish months ago on LinkedIn. I'm not going to read the whole thing. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I'll post it there again so you can read the whole thing. But I want to call out a few pieces of it. The first is this. Where did the designers go? It feels ghostly. No exciting products, no what's new in design discussions, conferences seem muted, it's just eerie and silent. This gentleman goes on to say, why is it not clicking? There. A C-level finance person told me today, the design industry has changed. These days, we order things from an agency and they deliver. If we don't like it, it just goes in the trash. It's so cheap. Now, Fast Company also recently came out with an article with the headline, Why Did Corporate America Break Up with Design? Now, whether you agree with this 100%, whether you agree with this partially, whether you disagree with it, the question is, are we in another shift between an old game and a new game? At Collins, we think we are. And one of the, we lost power and status, just to put a finer point on it. So it's hard to say what this shift is right now because we're going through it, right? We're always trying to find language to concretize it and give meaning to what's going on. It's a little hard. It's like sort of smelling something in the air, like you smell it, but you can't quite name its source or what it is, but you know it's there and you keep trying to think and figure it out. I think we're kind of in that moment. And so at Collins, we've been really thinking a lot about this. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot on here is, what have you guys been up to? You guys have been oddly silent. Well, what we've been up to is actually lighting sticks of dynamite and putting it in different corners of our company. Whether that's a commercial model, what we do financially, our offering, how we think about our products and services, our talent, our operations, basically everything else. We're going to make Collins go boom. And this presentation is really the first time where we're kind of publicly talking about this. This is something that has really been in the works for about 2 years. And at the heart of it, we're not going to be able to get into all of it because, it's a lot of businessy stuff and this should be fun and not academic and wanging on about dumb stuff. But at the heart of it is a shift in our philosophy. When we started with this motto, incredible craft at incredible scale. The belief that you could do something beautiful at the largest scales with the largest companies in the world, and we fine-tuned our organization and our culture and our standards to be able to deliver that. That's still really important. But as in any shift between an old game and a new game, what got you to the level that you're at isn't going to get you to that next level. So you have to play a new game while honoring the past and using that as an engine for your future. So we'll always be deeply dedicated to this, but we now know this is table stakes for us. We need to think differently and larger. So the motto that animates us and is really driving all these sticks of dynamite that we're lighting and going to be rebuilding with is a very simple idea. Make the future so irresistible, it becomes inevitable. So what does that mean? It means lots of different things, but in the context of this conversation, we're going to introduce you to one very specific sliver of it. And it's the idea of identity systems. Identity systems have changed a lot from like corporate marks to these systems and so on. But we actually think that the next era of identity systems is this thing called brand worlds. And this just isn't like an academic thing where it's like a bunch of creative people saying, oh, I want to make more stuff, though I have to admit that's part of it. What we're actually seeing is a fundamentally different way that companies are building their brands. It's not just about paid advertising. It's not just about physical product. Yes, it is those things. But it's also partnerships, collaborations, experiential events, content production, all of this stuff that wasn't around in the 70s or 90s as key critical parts. I feel like every brand today is like creating a fashion collab and dropping it somewhere, That's like an entirely new thing. And so when the context changes and brands start behaving differently, we can't just simply say it's an identity system that they need. That's really just a piece of it. We think it's a piece of a much larger brand world system. So what does that mean? I don't actually know what I'm supposed to be pointing at. So let us break down kind of how we're thinking about the structure of a brand world. Now, brand identity systems initially started with what's most authentic and what's most exceptional about a brand, and then how do we manifest that in a visual identity system to project it out into the world? Well, the first is, with this model, is that it starts in a different place. It starts with this idea of cultural membership. Now, companies, whether they are aware of it or not, whether they choose to entertain the conversation or not, are always part of a conversation, part of a culture. You cannot be an organization of humans and not bring a culture into that organization and that work and that worldview. And so a big part of building a brand world is understanding what is the culture you are participating in, what is the culture you are representing, what are the culture you are authentically contributing to, and then how do you bring that to life through the lens of the brand. So there are four then pieces to it. One is the visual identity system. Still got to communicate visually. That's still incredibly important. The other is verbal identity system. Still got to have a tone of voice with everything. But here's where it gets a little different. The other component is this idea of territory and spaces system. Now, for any of you who have ever done experiential work, you know that that has a lot to do with like materials. It has a lot to do with, the physical spaces that you create. But honestly, it is also about a choice of curation. So, for instance, like Walmart, like Louis Vuitton would never show up at NASCAR probably. There's just not the right context for them to show up at. So if a brand chooses not to show up somewhere, then that means a brand chooses to curate where it shows up to drive the story of the brand. So this idea of where you choose to show up and how you choose to show up physically become an important part of the system. And then finally, partnerships. Collaborations, partnerships, social influencers, who you show up with in the world is an incredibly important part of building your brand. And it's not just about picking whoever's hot, whoever has the most followers. You've got to find something that is aligned with the brand and comes from the community that you are representing. So this basic system is what we're practicing. And the interesting thing is that this applies to lots of different types of companies, more than you actually think. A lot of them are lifestyle brands, whether it's in fashion, luxury, hospitality, and so on. But it's also visionary brands that have a vision of how the world should be or how they're helping to change the world. This often comes from technology. It can come from CPG brands. It can come from entertainment brands, which in of themselves create these narrative universes. And increasingly, what we're starting to see in the RFPs that we're receiving is that clients are actually explicitly asking for brand worlds at a rate that I'm actually very surprised by. It used to be something that was just a dialogue within the creative community, but now clients are starting to ask for it because of the reasons that I outlined a moment ago. And so we want to take you through some applications of this. One of the first ones that we want to take you through is something that I did 5 years ago with two people who I hope are in this room because I know they're at the event this year, Kwame Taylor-Hayford and Lisa Smith. And this is some work that we did for Chobani. So just a little bit of background on me, because you're like, well, you co-founded Collins. What the hell are you talking about with Chobani? For 5 years, I left Collins to be the chief creative officer of Chobani. It was between 2016 and 2021. And so I'm going to take you through the work that Kwame, Lisa, and I did while we were there to transform that brand. And then, after that was completed, I came back to Collins in my current role as CEO, and so that's what we're doing today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of quick micro case study on Chobani. Because it's not here in the UK, it's not in Europe, so I got to give you guys some context. So Chobani basically looked like this. It was a Greek yogurt company. They were a single product company sold in the United States, mainly on the coast of the US. When they entered the yogurt aisle in the grocery store, in short, they were so successful that the entire yogurt aisle blew up. The yogurt aisle is one of the most profitable in a grocery store, so it was a very big deal that the grocery aisle got this big because Chobani brought so many people to the category. The challenge was Chobani was still a single product company, but more so they were the leader in Greek yogurt, and so what happens always to the leader is they get copied, so they were losing their differentiation. The other thing is that the yogurt category with a brand like Activia had a very kind of narrow, specific point of view on the experience of food and what they were offering. Because, quite frankly, Activia looked like deodorant. And it wasn't just Activia, it was actually a lot of different brands. Oikos, also sold in the US, looked like deodorant. Oikos looked like deodorant. Yoplait looked like deodorant. So the question was, were we going to design the Chobani deodorant? No, that would have been awful. But we had to figure out what we were going to do. And so when we looked at the community that was around Chobani, because Chobani had this like fervent excitement around it, it was very clear that they were part of a wellness community. And these pictures can be a little deceiving because it makes it look like people who go to the gym and stuff were the ones who were eating Chobani. Yes, they were, but they weren't the only ones. And so when we actually did some research on it, we found there were like two dimensions that kind of defined people who were really passionate about Chobani. And these were people who used food for political reasons, meaning they wanted to grow free-range chicken or they wanted to eat grass-fed cows. They really ate food that was good and healthy and simple to change the system. Other people did it because they were trying to optimize their health. Other people did it because they wanted to use Chobani to kind of explore creations and express themselves and use it as creativity. And then other people really loved food and Chobani just as a way to bring people together, a sort of communal aspect around food. And so these were like four different corners of the food-focused wellness industry. So we had to figure out something that kind of united this culture. And we came across this quote from this PhD who had been studying it. But basically what he says is that the wellness movement is all about maximizing the health of all organisms, and that it is believed that the most effective way to do that is through food. Now that was really profound for us because it put what Chobani was doing at the center of a wellness culture. And because Chobani had scale and influence, it could meaningfully contribute to that as a food manufacturer in the United States. But there was a different tonality to all of this than just, hey, Chobani is good, healthy, clean label food. When you looked at what people were saying about Chobani, there was this narrative of almost a magical, transformative quality to what they were doing. Now, this did not go past us underappreciated, because really this speaks to a much deeper mythology and ethos around food, which is food is magic. You go back to a lot of our ancient narratives, whether it was the Greeks knocking down walnuts because they were trying to, they believed that those were part of good fortune, or it was the Incans drinking chocolate right before going into battle because they thought it gave them super strength. Of course, it's part of the fairy tales that we tell each other with Jack and the Beanstalk, or Popeye eating spinach and becoming Superman, or a mushroom and growing larger in the games that we play. Even if we look at the modern contemporary language around a lot of food in the wellness space, we can see these mythological, magical narratives in it. Energy shots, superfood, aphrodisiacs, soul food, miracle herbs. This speaks to a latent belief that food is magical, that it is transformative. And so when we thought of the wellness culture, the visual way that we wanted to bring this to life was through this idea of folk magic. This idea that people who have long believed this would have a visual language for expressing this in authentic, organic ways. And so, again, this is a micro case study, but just to give you kind of a sense of how we started bringing that to life, Lisa and I started doing mark making. We created a bunch of these kind of images that kind of brought a sense of optimism and joy to the expression of the brand. We also tried to find ways to change the brand in itself. So this is a typeface created by Grant Hutchinson in 1990 to represent the future of the internet. And it had nothing to do with food. It had nothing to do with wellness. This was about the broadband era. And so we're like, this doesn't make any sense. This is too machinist and too refined for Chobani. So we brought something in that felt like it had been in your grandmother's kitchen and had more of the characteristics to the letter forms that you found in the product. And to visualize this stuff, we were really inspired by a 1960s film called Kodak Ektachrome, which was this beautiful photography style that you could take pictures of just everyday stuff and it elevated it by giving this kind of like shimmering patina to anything where the colors became more saturated and sort of the experience that you were photographing became a lot more romantic, even magical in its sensibility. You could even take a picture of a factory and do this. So we began shooting food. Mundane, everyday food that you get at a grocery store for a few cents, few pence, and don't really think much about. But when you start capturing it through this lens, through this worldview, it lifts. And a raspberry isn't just a raspberry is a jewel. And so when we started creating photography and stories around it, we made sure that everything felt magical and had this sense of otherworldliness about it. In terms of the verbal identity, we were really inspired by this idea of a fairy tale tone of voice, because if it was folk magic, a lot of folk magic is represented in the fairy tale stories we tell ourselves. So we were really inspired by turn-of-the-century fairy tale books and the type specimens in them, and ended up creating a beautiful typeface out of it called Chobani Serif. I don't know why this is not going forward. There we go. And then brought that into the identity system with a tone of voice that felt like it could have been a line pulled from a fairy tale character. So as it came to where Chobani should pop up, we wanted this to build on that idea that was inspired by the photography, this idea of magical realism, that there were everyday moments that just felt elevated from the everyday. And so there was a Chobani Cafe in Soho, New York, and of course we redesigned it, but we also brought in food that in of itself felt magical, redesigned the menu. This was one of the first activations that we did in Grand Central Terminal in New York City, but it was this magical experience where you go put your hand on something and it created this activation of sending light up to this canopy of trees, and it ignited it and all this fruit grew. We created commercials that depicted these magical worlds, almost like this Peter Pan, Never Never Land type of vibe, but with food. Worlds where when you ate Chobani yogurt, you had these magical powers to transform the world around you, simplifying it, reducing it. And then one of the last things that I did before I left was actually create a vision of the future for Chobani. We worked with Studio Ghibli and their composer and the line to kind of produce this spot that imagined a world where food had a dramatic impact on the way we live our lives, better integrating agriculture and technology with each other to create a more kind of bucolic, inclusive world. And so the final one, which I won't go into just for sake of time, is just partnership. So when we knew the culture we were coming from, we had a filter for making decisions on who we involved in the storytelling of the brand. So this was other wellness brands and wellness influencers that we worked with. But what ended up happening was this became the filter with which we guided all our decision making. And so we created this world. A world that we aimed to have it feel like it came from a fairy tale, that a world that you wanted to live in. In fact, many of the comments on that Studio Ghibli spot that we said was, and you can see this on YouTube and all the comments, but people were like, I'm so pissed off that this is a television commercial because I wanted it to be a movie, because I wanted to live in that world. Can Chobani please make a movie out of this? Specifically, that was exact phrasing for many of them. So we had this world that emerged from Chobani, and it was a world that a lot of people wanted to live in. And it has become the sort of de facto visual language of wellness culture. Even to this day, you still see brands referencing Chobani in their own identities to show that they are part of wellness culture. And it all comes back to this model. And so what Brian's going to do is he's going to take you through two other examples, one with a more recent client that we've worked with, and then finally a little bit about us and how we're bringing this model in to affect what we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. There you are. I can't see you from back there. Good morning.